Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to colleagues joining us from across the world. I'm Dr. Brigitte Kouri, President-elect of the International Union of Psychological Science, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this first webinar in the IUPsyS webinar series on psychological science diplomacy, titled Advancing Global Solutions, Psychological Science in a New Era of Diplomacy. Um, just a second. So my screen suddenly closed. Okay. At a time of increasing global complexity and uncertainty, there is growing recognition that many of the challenges facing humanity require renewed forms of international cooperation and evidence-informed engagement. We are therefore pleased to convene this discussion, bringing together perspectives from psychology, science diplomacy, and the broader international scientific community. Actually, IUPsyS itself emerged from this broader international vision. Following World War II, and at the encouragement of UNESCO and the international scientific community, IUPsyS was formally established alongside other international scientific unions in recognition of the importance of rebuilding international cooperation through science, dialogue, education, and shared human understanding. The principles underpinning the formation of the Union remain profoundly relevant in today's increasingly fragmented global environment. As the global voice of psychological science, IUPsyS represents 95 national members, 7 regional members, and 20 affiliate members, spanning the full breadth of diversity of the global psychology community. The Union is in consultative status with the UN Economic and Social Council, in formal associate relations with UNESCO, is a member of the Psychology Coalition at the UN, and maintains official relations with WHO. IUPsyS is also the representative body for psychological science within the ISC, the International Science Council, and collaborates extensively with interdisciplinary associations across the world. Importantly, the strength of IUPsyS lies not only in its global role, but also in its ability to convene diverse voices, disciplines, regions, and perspectives in dialogue around shared global challenges, as reflected in today's webinar. We are deeply honored to be joined today by distinguished panelists and colleagues from around the world, and we thank all participants for taking the time to engage in this important conversation. I have a few housekeeping notes. Here they are. This is actually the technical information for your participation. If you'd like to take a screenshot or a picture of it, that way you can keep it, because I think it's somehow a bit complicated or there's a lot of information. This slide is in English and the next slide is in Spanish. So my Spanish is not that fabulous, but I'm sure for our Spanish-speaking colleagues, this would be helpful. Again, if you'd like to take a picture of it and keep it for later on once we open the discussion. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Professor Nora Sveos. Professor Sveos is a professor emeritus in the Department of Psychology at the University of Oslo. She has worked for many years with refugees as a clinician and researcher, and established the Human Rights Commission at the Norwegian Psychological Association. She served for 16 years across 2 United Nations anti-torture treaty bodies, including the UN Committee Against Torture and the UN Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture. She has published extensively on psychology and human rights, and is also the founder of the NGO Mental Health and Human Rights Info. Professor Sveos, thank you very much for moderating today's webinar, and I now hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Brigitte, and welcome to all of you to this first webinar on psychological science diplomacy. We're so happy that so many have registered and want to follow this seminar today. We have planned this as the first one in a series of similar webinars highlighting and discussing the role and potentials of psychology in strengthening rights, international cooperation, and peace. So today I have the honor of moderating this webinar and introduce the organizers as well as the distinguished speakers we have with us today. I am member of the Presidential Task Force on Psychological Science Diplomacy within the International Union of Psychological Science. The task force was established in 2022 with the aim to develop a conceptual framework for psychological science diplomacy that will facilitate global cooperation between the Union and the international partners and other organizations. The task force contributes to the promotion of effective interaction between psychological science and international policy objectives of the Union. So the topic of this webinar today is Advancing Global Solutions, Psychological Science in a New Era of Diplomacy. So why this topic? Why is it important to speak about these things? So, as often is referred to today, we live in a world where tension, ongoing conflict, disruption, polarization, and insecurity dominate lives and living conditions and create fragmented responses, to the serious challenging we are facing. We often also hear that the post-World War II rules-based order is seriously challenged, meaning the structured system of rules, norms, and institutions that govern interaction among states, creating predictability and stabilization in global relations. All this is seriously weakened today. We also see that multilateral collaboration is undermined and the respect for fundamental human rights is eroding. Important multilateral organizations and initiatives are under threat, resulting in serious consequences because of the reduced ability to follow up on the many and life-saving tasks and responsibilities that such organizations have. A very clear example is the WHO, the World Health Organization, that struggles against serious cuts and limitations, something which has life-threatening consequences to a lot of people. We also know that something is happening in the democracies of the world. In several countries, democracy is in decline, and this backsliding is part of a global trend that political scientists refer to as a reverse wave or democratic regression. And for the first time in 50 years, there are more countries moving toward autocracy than democracy. This is very serious. At the same time, we know that the number of armed conflict in the world is expanding, and the world of 2026 is witnessing a severe spike in armed conflicts. We see massive conventional wars between states and also complex regional insurgencies, and this makes global security increasingly fragile. And these conflicts are particularly devastating for ordinary people, for civilians, where we as part of the ongoing conflict see not only military action, but sexual violence, torture, destruction of communities, children without parents, famine, and no protection against these forms of violence. And we also know a lot of the effects of these acts, the immediate ones, as well as those on the longer run. So we are in fact speaking about the mass production of generational trauma. And as part of this, international law is facing significant challenges. And by international law, again, we think about sets of rules and standards, formal sets of rules and standards governing the relationship between nations. But more specifically, the humanitarian international law, known as the Human Rights in War, or the four Geneva Conventions protecting civilians and aid workers, are also not respected, and that the important protective provisions within these conventions are not complied with by states in conflict, meaning serious blows to the civilian part of the population. Another aspect of this dismal situation is what often termed the shrinking space of civil society, meaning that the room for action by civil society organizations, such as us, is reduced. Human rights defenders threaten and face difficulties when expressing thoughts and action that may be seen in opposition to the power. We're also entering an area in which artificial intelligence and digital technologies increasingly influence communication, political discourse, social trust, and human behavior. While these developments hold important possibilities, they also create new challenges related to misinformation, manipulation, polarization, and the erosion of trust. This further underlines the importance of psychosocial and psychological science in understanding human behavior, strengthening responsible and international cooperation. So it is with this painful and dramatic background we call for collective action and solidarity in the face of the global challenges, also referred to by Brigitte in her opening speech. And we ask the question, how can we, as psychologists, contribute by actively making our science relevant, highlighting the insights and knowledge accumulated over many years, and employ these in diplomatic efforts for obtaining peace, justice, and reconciliation? How can science diplomacy be a tool in relation to these many difficult challenges? And this is what we are talking about today. And our webinar has the following objectives. First of all, to introduce the concept of science diplomacy and provide an overview of the science diplomacy ecosystem and its evolving global landscape. To identify and showcase concrete ways in which psychological science has contributed to international diplomacy, global cooperation, and policy development, with particular emphasis on psychological science diplomacy. To propose psychological science diplomacy as a strategic guiding framework for the global work of the Union and its membership, supporting international collaboration, advocacy, and capacity building. And finally, to promote interdisciplinary engagement across psychology, diplomacy, public policy, and related fields, while advancing psychological science diplomacy in the service of humanity, sustainable development, and global public good. And to talk about this, we have a group of very fine speakers, and I will introduce them as we go along. But before I do this, I will remind all of you of the recent statement adopted by the Union, March 21st this year, on war and the responsibilities of psychological science. I know that Teman will speak more about this later on, but I want to ensure that all of you take note of this, read it, and disseminate it, and try to work by it. So I now have the great pleasure of introducing our first speaker this evening or today, Branislav Pantovic. You are a science diplomat. You have been specializing in international affairs analysis over 20 years of experience across Europe and Latin America. Originally, Branislav is from Serbia, but is based in Argentina and holds a PhD in international relations. You're the Vice President of Diploscientifica, the Science Diplomacy Network for Latin America and the Caribbean. His focus is on emerging technologies, humanitarian issues, and science as a global public good. He also serves at the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, supporting evidence-based decision-making on geopolitical and technological trends. Co-developed Argentina's first postgraduate program in science diplomacy at the Universidad Nacional de La Plata. So it's with a great honor I will give the floor to you, and you will share your slides. And welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nora. Thank you very much for inviting me here. And definitely what I would like to do in these few minutes is offer a simple but I think necessary message that science diplomacy is definitely not a miracle solution. It does not float about politics. It does not raise conflicts. it does not automatically create trust between actors who are competing, mistrusting each other or operating under very unequal conditions. Science diplomacy, I would say, is shaped by power, capacity, and context, exactly as this slide says. So some actors have more funding, more diplomatic presence, more access to global agenda setting spaces, but others have maybe excellent knowledge and talents, but maybe weaker institutions, less visibility or fewer opportunities to influence global decisions. This definitely matters because science diplomacy is sometimes presented as if science were a neutral bridge. In practice, definitely it is a very complex. Science can open doors, but it enters rooms already structured by hierarchies, interests, identities, fear, and maybe strategic calculations. And I would say that my own trajectory has made this very clear to me. As you mentioned, I came from Serbia. I built much of my academic and professional path in Argentina and Latin America. And I work at the intersection of international relations, science diplomacy, humanitarian analysis, etc. So from those different contexts, I definitely saw that knowledge is never only technical, it is political. And the question is who produces it, who translates it, who trusts it, and maybe who has the power to act on it. So my starting point is this: science diplomacy cannot solve political conflicts by itself, but it can open limited space, maybe where actors can address shared challenges, identity, emerging needs, maybe build trust and reduce risks. And that limited space is definitely an important space. It may sound modest, but in fragmented world, even limited space for dialogue can be strategically and humanly valuable. So the classic way of explaining science diplomacy is through three dimensions. The first one is science in diplomacy. The second one is diplomacy in science. And the third, science for diplomacy. Science in diplomacy is definitely where science provides evidence to inform diplomatic decisions. For example, climate science informing negotiations, public health evidence guiding global responses, or AI expertise helping governments understand new technological risks. The second one, when we talk about diplomacy for science, diplomacy helps scientific cooperation happen. It opens access to infrastructure, facilitates mobility, creates agreements, and sometimes keeps scientific channels open even when political relations are tense. And the third one is the science for diplomacy, where scientific cooperation itself become a way to build trust. Shared research agendas can create relationship where formal politics is blocked or maybe fragile. So this model is still very useful, but I must say today, I think we need to go beyond these classic three dimensions. And if you ask me why, well, because the world has changed quite a lot since 2010. Science and technology now are arenas of geopolitical competition. Artificial intelligence, quantum technology, satellite data, biotechnology, neurotechnology, data infrastructure, name it. These are not only scientific fields, they are also sources of power. So I would mention two interacting arcs. The first one is science impacts diplomacy, since knowledge reshapes agendas, norms, and negotiation positions. Scientific evidence can redefine what counts as a risk, what counts as a responsibility, and what issues enter international negotiation. The second one is diplomacy impact science, where we can see political context define what science gets funded, what knowledge gets shared, what research becomes restricted, and maybe whose expertise is recognized as legit. So this is very important for Latin America and the Caribbean. I see science diplomacy not only as international cooperation, but it is actually a way to make regional voices more visible sometimes in debates often dominated by the global north. In other words, I would say that science diplomacy is not only about bridging science to power, it is also about asking how power shapes science. And there is one more layer: diplomacy inside science itself. Scientific communities also have those exclusions, linguistic inequalities, unequal access to journals, infrastructures, networks. So when we speak about science diplomacy, we should also ask who is allowed to represent knowledge internationally. And this is why I like this slide. It moves us from a simple model to a more realistic one. Science and diplomacy do not just interact, they shape each other. So now the key question is, how does knowledge actually become action? And this is where I think many science policy conversations become too optimistic. And we often assume that if evidence is strong enough, policy will follow. But evidence does not become policy by itself. Knowledge has to be translated. It has to be communicated in language that institutions can use. It has to be trusted. It has to arrive at the right time, and it has to connect with institutional capacity. This is something I work with directly in open source monitoring, horizon scanning, and international affairs analysis. But the difficulty is not only collecting information. In fact, we are surrounded by information. The difficulty is identifying what matters, what may change, what is emerging, and what decision makers need to understand before pressure becomes crisis. And this is why I would formulate this mechanism like this. Knowledge becomes policy when evidence finds application. But on the other side, policy becomes action when pressure demands response. And then anticipation means preparing before pressure becomes crisis. So for science diplomacy, anticipation is essential. It means not arriving late. It means using evidence not only to explain what already happened, but to detect weak signals, emerging risks, and future needs. But let's be honest, anticipation also requires legitimacy. If decision makers do not trust the source, well, evidence will be ignored. If institutions are not ready to act, well, evidence will remain a report, just a report. And if communication is poor, well, evidence will be misunderstood. So the pathway is definitely not simple. Science produces evidence, diplomats use it, policy change it. And the pathway is more fragile. Knowledge must pass through translation, trust, decision, and action. So this slide captures this mechanism directly. Anticipation requires timing, legitimacy, communication, and institutional capacity working in concert. But at the end, evidence is never received in vacuum. It passes through perception, identity, emotion, fear, maybe institutional culture and political interest. And two actors may look at the same evidence, but they may interpret it differently because they have different histories, different initiatives, and maybe different levels of trust. And this is why I would say trust is not a soft issue. Trust is an infrastructure. Without trust, evidence becomes another object. Without trust, uncertainty becomes a space for fear. Without trust, communication becomes noise. And maybe without trust, even excellent science can fail to influence decisions. So this is where psychological science has a direct role. Decision-making under uncertainty, biases, intergroup relations, polarizations. These are not abstract psychological themes. They are, I would say, everyday diplomatic realities. And the webinar concept notes or will note exactly these issues: trust building, uncertainty, intergroup relations, cross-cultural communications as central to diplomatic and scientific collaboration. And I would also connect this to a concept that is becoming increasingly relevant. For example, cognitive warfare. By cognitive warfare, I don't know if you know this, but it means attempts to influence how people perceive reality, maybe perceive information, trust informations, and make decisions. It is not only disinformation, it is deeper than false content. It targets attention, emotion, identity, fear, societal cohesion. So for science diplomacy, this is a serious challenge. If trust in science is weakened, well, if institutions lose credibility, if public debates become emotionally manipulated, then evidence-informed cooperation becomes much harder. So, but I would say this is also where psychology can contribute. Psychological science can help us understand why people distrust evidence, how fear spreads, how identities harden, how institutions communicate uncertainty. So my message to this audience is definitely simple. Psychological science is not just a resource for understanding individuals. It might be a resource for protecting the conditions of cooperation. And finalizing, let me close with one idea of agency. Science diplomacy cannot erase asymmetry. It cannot remove geopolitics. It cannot make conflict disappear, but it can definitely expand the space where evidence, trust, and responsibility operate. This is the central message of this final slide. So in many parts of the world, especially outside of the major centers of the power, science diplomacy is not about prestige. It is about access. It is about being present. When agendas are defined already, it is about connecting scientific capacity with foreign policy, public policy, and social needs. And when speaking about Latin American and Caribbean region, this means asking how science diplomacy can help address inequality, brain drain, climate vulnerability, health challenges, AI governance, technological dependency, name it. It also means asking how regional networks, just like Diplo Científica or Red de Cientes, I don't know if you heard about that one, can help build voices, capacity, and cooperation from the Global South, not as passive, but as contributors to them. So science diplomacy is the attempt to create responsible spaces, I must say, for knowledge inside power. And this is where psychology definitely matters, because diplomacy is not only institutions speaking to institutions, it is people interpreting risks, negotiation, identity, managing uncertainty, whatever about that. Knowledge becomes useful only when it can travel through those human and institutional filters. So the task ahead is not simple to produce more evidence. It's to build the conditions under which evidence can be heard, trusted, and used responsibly. In a fragmented world, this may sound maybe modest, but it is not small, because when knowledge becomes trust and trust becomes cooperation, science diplomacy becomes more than a concept. It becomes an agency. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Branislav. I think you really, I mean, you not only took us through some of the definitions and the concepts that may be quite tricky sometimes to understand what's what and the next, but you also encourage really the active use and the participation of knowledge. And I was thinking, this is a message that should go out to all psychologists in the world, not to speak of a university and everywhere where people are being trained, so that they identify with the importance of having this knowledge and being able to share. So and to make a difference. So thank you again very much for this very, very enlightening presentation. And also we are receiving some questions and we will be raising them towards the end of this presentation. So I will go on now. I'm very happy to present you, Peter, and I will try again to share my screen with So, now, this is okay? You see it? So, Peter Luckerman, you are the president of the International Science Council since 2021, internationally recognized biomedical scientist and science diplomacy leader, former chief science advisor to the Prime Ministers of New Zealand 2009 to 2018, and also former science envoy for the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. You are the founding chair of the International Network for Government Science Advice and have published more than 700 scientific papers and academic and public-facing books. International expert on science policy, risk assessment, and science diplomacy. Fellow member of multiple leading international scientific academies, including the Royal Society of London and the US National Academy of Medicine. So I'm very happy to present you now, and you will speak about the evolution of science diplomacy, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, let me congratulate Branislav. I think that was an excellent oversight of the issues that we face. If you just go back 10 years, 11 years now, 2015, the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Agreement on Disaster Risk Reduction, the initiation of the SDGs. The world was in a very different place to where it is now. We were in a period of optimism, relative cooperation, and science was at the center of a lot of decision making. Where we sit now, as Branislav has already said, is in a very different place. Now, I could spend a lot of time on the International Science Council, but I'll go very quickly. I think all of you know that the International Science Council is the umbrella organization that brings the active scientific bodies, both the unions in social and natural sciences and the academies of the world together, and has a number of primary roles, including particularly the interface between the international active science community and the multilateral system, about which I'll say a bit more later. But I think in the context of how Branislav has already introduced the concept of science diplomacy, I think he's done it in the appropriate way. There's been a bit of a buzzword around science diplomacy, trying to claim that it's going to solve everything. And I think the modesty that he's brought to the discussion is important. At the end of the day, there's international science cooperation, and science has relied a lot on the openness of how scientists work with each other. And it may have some diplomatic outcomes at different levels, from local to global. And of course, the science diplomacy itself. And that's where I want to focus. If we think about science and diplomacy, they're two fundamentally different cultures. Science is fundamentally a negotiation about reality, about truth. Scientists debate and negotiate to try and come to conclusions about truth. Diplomats are not about that. Diplomats are about negotiation, about interests. They're about negotiations to promote the interests that they're advocating for. We usually talk about it at the national level, but it need not be at the national level. So both systems are under stress. Science is undergoing great change, many more actors. The role of technology is changing. The role of the non-state actor is far more important in science than it was before. Most of the major developments in science, in life sciences, and the digital sciences now involve non-state actors who have as much power as a nation state. On the other hand, the role of diplomacy is changing for the very reasons we've talked about. The undermining of the global of the rules-based order around which the world has operated since 1945. The multipolar system that's emerged from the hegemony of the United States in 1945 to the bipolar system of the First Cold War, to now we have a multipolar world, which is very complex, and different alliances are formed for different purposes. In that realm, then we've seen a number of changes that mean that science diplomacy itself is changing. Science diplomacy had its origins really in the First and Second World Wars around security and defense interests, and then after the Second World War was really about the major powers projecting interests around the world using knowledge and science to do so. But at the same time, science diplomacy became very aspirational. And most of the academics in science diplomacy were thinking in terms of world peace, in terms of some grand, and they always highlight, for example, the Antarctic Treaty as the epitome of science diplomacy, where in fact it was always about national interests. The reason the world agreed on the Antarctic being a continent for peaceful purposes and scientific purposes was not aspirational. It was simply the Soviet Union and the United States wanted to agree themselves that they didn't want to compete on that territory. We've gone through a period where science diplomacy has become much more pragmatic. For example, the relationships that might be tense between countries can sometimes have a science to help resolve them. For example, the famous example was the trade war between New Zealand and Australia over apples, went on for 84 years and was resolved simply by the science showing that there was no apples in New Zealand that had the fruit fly. Another example would be Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda may have great tension, but they have worked together to protect the mountain gorilla. There have been, until recently, there was a lot of action between Israel, Palestinian Authority, Jordan, on protecting the Jordan Valley. There's still activities that go on despite what's going on and that horrific conflict, which involve common resource management. But what we've seen most recently in what's happened in the last few years has been a collapse to a very transactional relationship. Science is now being traded in the same way that other things are traded. We will give you access to this science in return for something that we want. And so we're seeing an example of that, which may not be necessarily relevant because things don't stay the same, was when the United States was willing to give the United Kingdom access to some aspects of artificial intelligence in return for some agreements in the trade space. So there's some very interesting dynamics going on. At the end of the day, when I look at it from the big changes that we need to worry about are the fact that the multilateral system is in real trouble. It's not functioning at all. Of course, we need to remember it's never had executive function. It's always been a place to talk, but executive function lives with individual jurisdictions. And I think that one of the important things in science diplomacy is it's not so much what happens at the United Nations as what happens in your domestic environment to persuade your diplomats how they should act at the United Nations or at any other multilateral system. Secondly, as I've already said, we've seen the huge increase in the power of non-state actors, particularly the mega companies of the United States and China, but others are emerging in other places. And now countries are actually treating them as if they're national entities. A number of countries have ambassadors to the Silicon Valley. They treat them as if they're a national actor. And of course, in many cases, we've seen a loss of technological sovereignty for small countries in the face of the power of these non-state actors. And then, not finally, but the issue that worries me most, and has already been mentioned by Nora in particular at the beginning, is the global commons under a real threat. The SDGs have clearly failed. We can debate why they've failed, but they failed in the context that's been alluded to: changes in democracy, changes in societal relationships, and in the short-term thinking of diplomats and politicians debating short-term interests at the expense of long-term interests of the planet and the people on it. And in that regard, I think this is where the opportunity lies. We need to be thinking now about what happens after 2030. There'll be a new Secretary General at the end of this year. Can we see that as an opportunity to reignite action on the global commons? The current SDGs were not really designed scientifically. They were designed diplomatically, with scientific input coming in after the event. The issue that the International Science Council is reflecting on, and I've been leading a number of discussions on it, is can we actually reverse that so that science informs the diplomats before decisions are made on what the structure of the post-SDG agenda would look like? And then the last thing I want to comment on with any specificity is the distinction between track 2 and track 1 diplomacy. Track 1 diplomacy is what diplomats do all the time. They negotiate with each other. Track 2 diplomacy is what you're practicing and what we're practicing, where we're trying to use the informal mechanisms outside the formal processes of diplomacy to try and advance on interests of diplomatic interests. Now, in the first Cold War, there was great successes. The most obvious would be the Villach Conference of 1985, which was a conference jointly held by IUPsyS, the predecessor of the International Science Council, and the World Meteorological Organization, which brought the scientists together to say the diplomats had to act on global warming. And that conference led directly from 1985 to the formation of the IUPsyS and what's followed since then. Now, we can debate how successful it's been, but in reality, without that initial step in track 2 diplomacy, then we would never have got to the point of the IUPsyS being formed. Now, there's many soft examples. For example, the United States under Obama used track 2 diplomacy between the National Academy of Sciences and the Cuban Academy of Sciences to try and get some rapprochement between Cuba and the United States. In my world, I'm often the interface between formal diplomacy and the informal nature of what scientists can do really does matter. And I think in the world that we're now facing, it's going to become much more important. Right at the beginning of the talk, both Branislav and Nora, and Brigitte all referred to the role of psychological sciences. There's no doubt that understanding what trust means, understanding how the process of negotiation works, how we transfer knowledge from one culture, the culture of science, to the culture of diplomacy and the culture of business, and in the other directions, is going to become very, very important. So finally, the role of the ISC. Well, the ISC's been undergoing, considerable change to be more focused on the challenges ahead. So we've now made science diplomacy one of the core pillars of the International Science Council's responsibilities. We've always had a role as co-chair of the major group on science and technology to the United Nations, but that's a relatively weak role. We've now been acting much more with direct UN agencies, as well as with the UN Science Advisory Board and the Secretary General's office. And I'll just finish with one good example. Last year, or the year before, the ISC co-led with the United Nations Environment Programme an exercise on foresight. And I think Branislav referred to foresight. I think if we don't now start to use our understandings of the possibilities ahead and how we need to make decisions now that will shape the future, we will fail. And so that we're working much more closely with most of the UN agencies that matter, the UNEP, UNDP, WHO, FAO, UNESCO, etc., to try and encourage the better use of anticipatory foresight and thinking about how science and diplomacy need to come together in future years. I'll stop now because I could talk for much longer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. And it would be wonderful that you just could go on, but we have other people who will talk to. But thank you so much. And I think you've given us such a wonderful overview and placed some of these buzzwords. I think what you say about coming to a more pragmatic understanding of the role, I think that is so significant. And also when you spoke about the non-state actors, I was thinking about not only the non-state actors you mentioned, but also the whole civil society, the whole university, the whole scientific environment as a very strong, very different non-state actor, but really has a strong contribution. And I think there's a lot in the UN system that would just fall apart had it not been because of the strength of civil society, often facing very difficult situations. So thank you so much for this, and we could go on commenting on what you said, but I'm now very happy to go on, and we will have some questions to you, and you will comment each other. So I will now want to introduce to all of you Oscar Barberin, who is also part of the task. Who's also part of the presidential task force in the Union, and you will be speaking now, and I will not share the screen. I will share the screen to introduce you. And here you are. Oscar, you are a researcher and a clinician and specializing in clinical, developmental, and community psychology. Emeritus professor at the University of Michigan and professor at the University of Maryland. You have extensive experience in multinational research, collaboration, consultation, and capacity building, and you have focused on poverty, violence, and mental health outcomes of children and communities. Former chair of the U.S. National Committee for Psychology, and you have promoted international psychological research collaboration and science diplomacy initiatives. Former executive committee member of the Union and a representative to the United Nations in New York. Oscar, I'm very pleased to work with you, and I want to give you the floor, and Carl will give us now the recordings of your presentation. So the floor is yours.
So first of all, thank you for joining in this session on psychological science as a resource for diplomacy. Next slide. Next slide, please. So there are many ways to approach the topic of psychological science and science diplomacy. We've heard a number of rich approaches already presented by two speakers. One is to review the many ways psychology and science are already directly involved in science diplomacy. Within psychology, it can occur by convening, next slide, please, convening congresses, regional meetings, facilitating research partnerships, and open science initiatives. Previous slide, please. So my aim actually is to take a somewhat different approach. I'm going to be talking about ways to consider the insights that psychology can offer as an effective way to conduct diplomacy. My presentation takes the second path to discuss what psychology has to offer to diplomacy in general. It will consider selective insights about why diplomatic efforts fail or what might be done about these failures. As a science of behavior, just about every area of psychology has some ideas to offer. However, due to time limitations, I can only focus on a few that I believe have unique relevance for diplomacy. Next slide. Solving global problems require rational thought and dispassionate analysis of facts. But psychologists have discovered that emotions have an outside influence over our decisions. To make matters worse, human judgment is often flawed by oversimplification, ignoring or misrepresenting facts, which we do not see until we believe it. These flaws are confounding and surprisingly common. Tension, conflict, fear make them worse. Some inflame passions, and others distort reasoning in ways that make negotiation and cooperation difficult. These flaws include issues related to social identity, heuristics, a quest for significance, and individual psychological impairment. Next slide, please. Flawed thinking our relationship to one another stands in the way of developing the notion of others as similar to ourselves. And so social psychological research has pointed out how we humans are just inclined to develop views of others as us versus them, the in-group or the out-group. This leads to miscommunication and interpersonal prejudices. We tend to view those in our in-group as virtuous and rational, whereas others are viewed with prejudices. The in-group versus out-group dynamic leads to attributional biases such as stereotyping and reactive devaluation of them. Next slide, please. Flawed thinking and emotional arousal are the bane of diplomacy. Cognitive research has demonstrated that decision-making is predictably error-prone. This work, pioneered by psychologist Herbert Simon and later expanded by Kahneman and Tversky, labeled these areas heuristics. That is, mental shortcuts, rules of thumb, to simplify the complicated. Heuristics are neither good nor bad in se. Sometimes they can be accurate, but often they result in superficial biased thinking or attributional biases such as stereotyping. I'm going to go through a few of these. So probably one of the most well-known is loss aversion. It occurs when the possible regret over a potential or anticipated loss is more motivating than the pleasures or benefits of gaining something positive. As a consequence, parties are more willing to accept risks to avoid loss than to achieve something they desire. For example, leaders may accept disproportionate risks to avoid losing territory or status. In negative framing, a proposal can be rejected if it is negatively framed, for example, as requiring some unfair sacrifice. But the same proposal may be accepted if it were framed positively as necessary to prevent a loss. Anchoring refers to an initial offer, a number, a position that becomes an anchor, a baseline, disproportionately narrowing the range of options to be considered. These anchors can lock parties into an arbitrary standard for evaluating a compromise or judging success. Confirmation bias leads decision makers to overweight evidence that supports what they already believe. Leaders may overlook critical intelligence that contradicts their existing beliefs, leading to flawed assessments and escalation. Next slide, please. Reactive devaluation is particularly damaging. In this case, sound proposals are discounted simply because they originate from an outgroup or adversary, leading to missed opportunities for compromise. And unfortunately, even sophisticated actors are susceptible to this error. Fast thinking often occurs under time pressures and stress. During rapid crises, individuals often rely on fast emotional reactions and intuitive reasons. That is, they make decisions from the gut. which are prone to errors like overconfidence or ignoring a lack of evidence and the possibility that there are critical unknowns. Interesting, the need for cognitive closure is something that we often experience. We like order to perceive order in the world. This forces people to grasp for and rely on early information, to lock in on a judgment, reducing the ability to consider alternatives or more feasible, accurate, and effective options. This is a form of closed-mindedness, or individuals favor speed over accuracy in order to avoid the discomfort of ambiguity and indecision. Together, these heuristics map directly onto diplomatic failure. They explain why parties may escalate rather than accept a deal, why identical proposals are treated differently depending on who offers them, and why early positions can foreclose consideration of creating options and distort the entire negotiation process. Heuristics are predictable futures of human cognition, particularly under stress. Next slide. There are also psychological dynamics that influence decision-making. Aria Kruglanski, for example, points to another need, a universal human need to matter, to maintain stature and be respected. These psychological needs of leaders and their people often dictate national decisions, especially when faced with having to compromise what they consider to be sacred values. Aggression can stem from such overcompensation for perceived slights or humiliation, as seen, for example, in Russia's post-Soviet efforts to reclaim its national stature. Kruglanski also identifies a need for closure, a desire for quick, definitive answers. These can lead leaders to seize on early information and form rigid opinions, particularly in high stakes and crisis situations. Next slide. Perhaps the most difficult issues to deal with are issues that relate to individual psychological impairments in leaders and sometimes in people. Diplomatic success often depends on the psychological health of both parties. This is not always the case. Personality and mental health problems and sociopathic thinking can present conditions that make it impossible for rational decision-making. For examples of personal difficulties can sabotage, including the following: paranoia, that is a fear of persecution or delusions of grandeur; narcissism, which is characterized by grandiosity, preoccupation with oneself and one's importance, an exaggeration of one's achievements combined with a strong need for admiration. It also includes exploitive behavior, lacking in empathy for others. It is also characterized by a belief in being special, superior, and possessing unlimited powers, but at the same time being unable to tolerate criticism. Mood disorders and addictions and cognitive decline also create difficulties. Next slide, please. Fortunately, psychological science can offer some ways to work around and mitigate the effects of excessive emotional arousal and flawed thinking. The most direct, compelling insights come from a set of empirical studies using the prisoner's dilemma paradigm. To refresh your memory, in the prisoner's dilemma, two suspects are arrested and offered a choice: betray one another or stay silent. If both remain silent, they may get a light sentence, for example, a year. If they both talk, they receive a moderate sentence, for example, 2 years. But if one talks and one does not, the betrayer goes free, and the silent one goes to a harsh sentence, 3 or more years. Now, self-interest would motivate the individuals to talk, even though cooperative silence would yield a better overall outcomes. And research, particularly that speaks to interactions that the parties expect to occur repeatedly over time. Research has found that cooperation can emerge among purely self-interested actors through a strategy they call tit for tat, which refers to contingent reciprocity. What this means is that each self-interested party can achieve its goals by being cooperative in the beginning, but show willingness to retaliate against the hostile act of the other person talking, and by forgiving enough to return to cooperating in order to avoid escalation. Surprisingly, behavior that is purely self-interested diminishes over time because it often leads to retaliation and undermines long-term gains. In other words, strategic reciprocity and restraint can transform conflict into lasting cooperative behavior. Next slide. Psychology also offers ways to deal with in-group versus out-group biases. And the emphasis is focusing on what parties have in common and on shared goals. For example, security, prosperity, or climate risk. Increasing cross-group contact and interactions, particularly when those interactions are characterized by equal status and common goals, these can increase group versus out-group acceptance. Positive contact can challenge stereotypes and reduce mutual hostility. Additionally, shifting norms and expectations to be more tolerant of differences can play a crucial role in fostering acceptance of others and can constrain demagogues who would exploit cultural and religious differences to dehumanize the other. These contact and norm-changing strategies create psychological space for negotiation, reducing threats, suspicion, and identity disparagement. Next slide. Kahneman and Tversky, in their seminal work, Thinking Fast and Slow, provide a framework for overcoming heuristic-driven thinking and promote slower, deliberate reasoning for high-stakes decision-making. In diplomacy, the urge towards fast thinking can be mitigated by creating environments that encourage slow thinking, such as making decisions within the context of past decisions rather than in isolation, and promoting a more rigorous self-criticism with exercises that anticipate what others would think about or how they would critique the decisions. Next slide. So a key insight from psychological science is this. While diplomacy ideally relies on rational calculations to resolve conflicts and foster cooperation, it is often hampered by flawed thinking and driven by the psychological needs and perceptions of the leaders and their populations. Psychological science contributes to diplomacy by addressing the human factors that undermine trust, strain relationships, distort communication, and create stalemates in tackling critical challenges. Psychological sciences provide valuable insights into why relationships fail and how they can be repaired, why us versus them perceptions harden, how trust is built or eroded, and how emotion dysregulation and cognitive biases skew judgment under threat. By promoting conditions for deliberate thought, weighing diverse options, and respecting differences, psychology offers practical guides for fostering international cooperation. Moreover, psychology can be more proactive in the future as a convener with other partners, employing these facilitative practices to bridge divides and work towards common goals of peace, economic justice, and preservation of the earth. Next slide. So there are many ideas, unfortunately, I did not have time to cover. However, I've written a handout, which you can request from me at the email on this slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oscar. And what you really did was include the psychological terms and knowledges and resources to be used, and both for an understanding but also strategically in diplomacy work. So it was really a very good example of bringing in the very concrete psychological strategies into what our two good friends have been saying already. So thank you very much for this. And I will now give the floor to Herman himself, Herman Guterres. I will share the screen and give you a brief presentation. You are, Herman, the current president of the International Union of Psychological Science. So I'm very pleased to work with you on the task force. You're a professor at the National University of Colombia, and as a research focus, it has been learning, behavioral evolution, the history of psychology. Also former leadership roles in Colombian and international psychology organizations. You have published a lot of articles, chapters, and scholarly papers, and you're the founder of the Observatory of Psychology in Latin America. So I will give the floor to you now, and then when you have finished your presentation, I will read out some of the very interesting questions that we have received already and give the four of you the possibility to comment on them very briefly. So here, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nora, very much. It's great to be part of this very important conversation on psychological science diplomacy and on science diplomacy more generally. I would like to briefly reflect on four interconnected themes, some of which have been mentioned by the other panelists. First, the foundational mandate of a scientific union of psychology over 75 years ago, actually this year. Also, the international ecosystem of psychological science. I would like to address the idea that psychology is a hub science and the importance of building global capacity to address humanity's most important pressing challenges. At the center of these ideas and these reflections, there is an idea that I believe is increasingly important for the future of our psychological science, of our discipline. And that is the development of psychological science diplomacy as a conceptual framework for organized global action within psychology. And also as a common language through which psychology can collaborate more effectively with other scientific disciplines and international institutions. So scientific unions emerge from a relatively simple but very powerful idea that science is an international human enterprise. Knowledge doesn't belong to one country or one culture or one language or one political system. Scientific knowledge advances through cooperation and of course through dialogue and through critique and so on. And it is a collective way of understanding our nature, our world. So this principle is particularly important in psychology because psychology seeks to understand human thought and emotion and behavior and relationships and development. But human beings do not exist in isolation. We are part of societies and cultures and economies and histories. So for that reason, psychology has always had an international cross-cultural dimension to it. The mandate of an international scientific union such as IUPsyS is of course to create the conditions under which psychological science can flourish, if you will, globally, and to contribute to humanity and to remain connected across borders, even during periods of geopolitical uncertainty and fragmentation and conflict. So that means supporting scientific exchange, and it means promoting inclusion and representation, and it means defending scientific integrity and an evidence-based dialogue. So increasingly, it means helping psychology engage with the major global conversations that take place in our current world. As some of you have mentioned before, we live in a world today that is profoundly interconnected, but also deeply polarized. Our president-elect and our moderator correctly pointed out that we face armed conflicts and the erosion of political misrepresentation and misinformation and forced migration and so on. So they are not only political or economic problems, they are above all, if you will, human problems. They are psychological problems in this sense. So in this context, scientific unions have a special responsibility, and especially a scientific union like the International Union of Psychological Science, and that is to preserve spaces for collaboration and to contribute to trust and to enhance different forms of dialogue, even when they become difficult. So science diplomacy becomes important precisely because of that, because it allows scientific communities to maintain some channels of cooperation and communication and mutual understanding across national and ideological borders. And of course, psychology, as has been mentioned, has much to contribute to that effort. So one of the reasons to advance psychological science diplomacy as a framework is that it provides psychology with a way of organizing its global contributions. And it helps align our scientific and educational and other efforts to share international goals, and also making psychology more visible and accessible and more useful to society. Psychological science operates today within a broad and interconnected international ecosystem. And that ecosystem includes, of course, universities and national psychological societies and all sorts of organizations. And it includes also global frameworks such as the International Science Council, the United Nations, UNESCO, and WHO. But very importantly, this ecosystem is not static. It is evolving very rapidly. For example, the geography of science is changing. There are new centers of scientific leaderships that are emerging at this point. And as we all know, digital technologies are transforming collaboration and knowledge production and so on. And very importantly, societies are increasingly demanding that science demonstrates social relevance and public value. And at the same time, in some of these very societies where there is tremendous dependence on science, there is also increasing distrust of the scientific institutions and even scientific knowledge and so on. So there are many political attacks on scientific expertise. So sometimes international collaboration is constrained by geopolitical tensions, as was mentioned before. So historically, much of psychological science has concentrated in a relatively small number of countries and traditions. However, recently, psychology has expanded to become a significant discipline and profession worldwide. So the future of psychology must be global, must be genuinely global. Truly international psychology cannot simply export theories developed in one context to the rest of the world. It must engage in reciprocal learning. And one of the most important functions of IUPsyS is precisely to help connect these diverse parts of the international psychological ecosystem. And I believe that psychological science diplomacy can help provide a shared framework for this job, for this work. Now, I would like to turn to an idea that I believe is especially important for the future of our psychological discipline, and that is that psychology is a hub science. It occupies a unique position among the sciences because human behavior and human experience intersect with nearly every major domain of societal life. As many of you may know, scientometric studies recently, or in the last couple of decades actually, have recognized psychology among a small number of hub sciences. So let me offer a couple of examples. One of them is related to public health. The recent experience with a global health crisis demonstrated clearly that trust and social cohesion and communication are central to our daily lives. And despite this important role, we must recognize that when the pandemic of the COVID-19 pandemic started, psychologists were not initially invited to contribute to the collective efforts to address this crisis in many countries. Also, to offer you another example, consider conflict and migration and violence. For decades, as Oscar correctly pointed out, psychology has contributed significantly to understanding the roots of hatred, dehumanization, and the psychological conditions that support or sustain violence and exclusion. And at the same time, psychology has helped illuminate pathways toward empathy and forgiveness and reconciliation and cooperation and so on. As Oscar described, psychological research has contributed to education for peace and conflict transformation and trauma recovery and so on and so forth. So despite these so many contributions, the influence of psychology on decision making is, to tell you the truth, a mixed bag of successes and failures. Perhaps you notice that in all the domains I mentioned, and the ones that were mentioned by Branislav and Oscar, psychology connects with many other sciences. It interacts with neuroscience and medicine and education and economics and anthropology, sociology, and so on and so forth. So that is why psychology can serve as a hub science. And this is important. It is not a matter of status in a superficial sense of self-importance. It is rather a recognition of capacity, but also it brings a sense of duty with our societies. So finally, I would like to speak about capacity building. If psychology is to contribute meaningfully to address social and global challenges, we must invest intentionally in global scientific capacity, and particularly in the case of psychology, which is our domain. So capacity building is not only about producing more research, but rather is about strengthening the human and institutional foundations of scientific cooperation, which includes education and training and ethical standards and many other aspects of our daily actions as a scientific enterprise. So we must be sure that talented psychologists everywhere, especially those from low and middle income countries, have opportunities to contribute to global conversations, but also they contribute to the important local conversations. Peter clearly indicated in his presentation that it is in the local context where most immediate and real diplomacy occurs. So no single activity only at the international level or at the local level is going to do the work, but we must integrate those levels of interaction to make our discipline relevant in a broader context. So let me offer some final reflection on this. When there are moments of fragmentation and conflict, there is the temptation to retreat inward, if you will, both at national level and institutional level and even ideological level. There is also the temptation, which is quite understandable, to seek retribution and continued punishment and isolating the other. This has been tried many times, once and again, and in science, this has been with very poor long-term results. So as Branislav suggested, diplomacy in science plays a significant role, and sometimes science and scientific organizations are used as tools of power. And we must be very careful, especially depending on our roles as leaders of science, to not be used as those tools of power. Of course, we must not be too optimistic and idealistic on the capacity of science diplomacy, but at the same time, we cannot afford to be discouraged and pessimistic. Science, of course, advances through openness, and humanity advances through cooperation, which we recognize now has been an extraordinary evolutionary force for humanity. So psychology at its best helps us understand not only individuals, but also the conditions that allow human communities to coexist and collaborate and to flourish. Science, psychological science matters deeply in the world that we are living in today, because it helps us understand conflict, but also helps us understand reconciliation. It helps us understand hatred, but also forgiveness, and polarization, but if you want, also dialogue, fear, but also hope. And that is why the international scientific cooperation in psychology matters very much. We agree very much with the ISC that science diplomacy can be a pillar to develop our mandate and to provide content for our vision and of being the global voice of psychology. And the future of psychological science diplomacy depends very much on building trust and mutual respect and intellectual openness. And I believe the global psychological community is well positioned at this moment to contribute to that future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Herman. And I think what you're really doing by talking about psychology as a hub science also, it really brings us out from our more traditional individual thinking to a wider perspective with a lot of responsibility of using our science. So thank you so much. And I will now suggest that we will go some minutes over time. And I will also want to thank all of you who have sent in very interesting questions. And what I'll do now, I will read out the questions, and I will, for time reasons, I will put them all together. But I will ask of each of the four of you to take note or to remember some of these, and then I will just give you 1 minute each to reply. And then finally, I will have to ask you, Herman, to just close the session. But I will want to refer to these questions. Claudia Alarcon has said, policy usually moves in 4-year election cycles, but science anticipation looks 25 years ahead. How do we build institutional memory that survives political shifts? I think that was such a great question. And then we have Jacqueline Cranny, who asks, how can science diplomacy be integrated into psychology education and training? And I think this is something all of us have been thinking about throughout, very important. Anna Rada has written or has asked, in an international system where geopolitical power influences which knowledge receives funding, visibility, and political influence, how can Latin America and the global South build a more equitable model of science diplomacy that reduces representational asymmetries and strengthens scientific and technological sovereignty? Thank you very much.
You're muted.
You're muted, Nora.
Then I say, Claudia Alarcon says, we talk about territory and space, but is the human mind the final frontier of national sovereignty? And Alejandra Rodriguez is saying, hello, good afternoon. As undergraduate students, we would like to know how we can support and participate as active contributors in these valuable initiatives. Also very valid. And the final question, and this is a lot food for thought for the four of you. Heidi Vilata Rojas says, Jacob Moreno spoke about society as a science aimed at healing society through relationships, groups, and collective actions. Considering what has been presented about reducing out-group bias, repairing relationships, overcoming errors of thinking, and understanding how groups become polarized, my question is, in the current global landscape of diplomacy and public action, what mechanisms could psychological science diplomacy create to integrate relational group-based approaches especially in Latin America, in order to promote a different way of acting, one more aligned with what psychological science teaches us about trust, cooperation, polarization, and the repair of relationships? Could this present a new way of doing politics, perhaps even a dream, but a necessary one? Thank you for great questions. And Branislav, I'll give you the floor for a brief comment. You can pick and choose.
Of
And
course.
then I will ask Peter if he has a comment to this, and follow Oscar and Herman. And I would love to include you, Brigitte, too, but I think perhaps we can stay listening, and we will let the gentleman reply. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great questions, definitely. I love this. I love when audience is active like this. So speaking about building institutional memory, for example, that was one of the first questions, if not the first one. I think by moving anticipation, I think that it should be done by moving anticipation from personal expertise to institutional routines. So, I mean, the key is to make anticipation part of the institution's work, not something that depends on who is temporarily in the office. So I think that one of the central tensions of science diplomacy, since politics often moves in electoral rhythms, every 4 years, while science has to think in generational time. So it is that is why I would not frame the problem only as politicians think short term and scientists think long term, but actually the deeper problem is institutional continuity. So many governments already know that climate, for example, AI, health, migration, or water security requires anticipation, but knowledge is often lost when ministers change, terms rotate, or priorities are rebranded. So this is something that I think it's very important. The other question that I think is
Branislav, I think I'll to leave some room for the others, I think also. But thank you very much. We could really go on, so we would, but thanks a lot. Peter, would you like to comment any of these questions? You can pick and choose. Yes, go ahead.
You're
Unmute
muted,
yourself.
Peter. You're muted.
Yeah, unmute yourself, and then we can hear you.
Very quickly, I'm going to make 3 quick points. One, building off what Brenislav's just said. We should remember what the purpose of foresight is. Foresight's not just thinking about the future. Foresight is about making decisions now so that the future is more likely to be in an acceptable form. And that's why institutionalizing foresight into policy making can survive political cycles. And it does survive political cycles if it's institutionalized. And I think Brenislav's already made that point. The second point I want to make is that scientists are very good at problem definition, not very good at problem solutions. Policymakers need solutions, not problems. And therefore, we need to be practical, and we need to find the small things that demonstrate solutions that policymakers can accept. And the third point I would make is we need to do it with humility. That was the point again that Branislav made at the beginning of this whole session. Science does not have all the answers. We cannot pretend it does. There are many things science cannot answer. And when we claim that we know more than we have, then we're not listened to. I think when we integrate with diplomats and policymakers with humility and acknowledge that there are other knowledge systems and other bases on which decisions are made, we're more likely to be listened to.
Thank you so much, Peter. There's a lot more to be said about this. Oscar, do you want to make a little comment to this before
yes, my video is disabled, so if you would enable that, it might help. But anyway, so I'd like to respond to the question of sort of how do we improve things so that we can, in fact, develop a set of experiences so that people can, in fact, focus on relationships and building trust. And what I would say, the phrase comes to mind, doctor, cure thyself. So I would say start small, start with our own organizations, our own
Mm, mm,
interactions, and try to implement some of the practices that we know that psychology has taught us work in terms of clear communication, in terms of embracing differences, in terms of taking time to reflect and to be self-critical. So you start with whatever social group you're working with and build to up to psychological organizations. And perhaps you can then, in your interactions with other organizations, bring those sets of values and practices.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I will now give the floor back to Herman for both for a comment on these questions, but also to conclude our session. So thank you again. So the floor is again yours, Herman.
Thank you very much, Nora, and thank you, everyone. Especially want to thank our panelists for helping us, explore this very important role of science diplomacy and to offer us an opportunity to present, to introduce psychological science diplomacy as a pillar, if you will, to address certain issues and organize our discussion within psychological science. Let me, as a way of concluding this webinar, go back to an idea that was expressed over 80 years ago in the famous Psychologist Manifesto in 1945, in the wake of World War II, when a number of psychologists, particularly from the US, wrote this manifesto indicating that psychology has a responsibility not only to understand human behavior, but also to help prevent war and advance human welfare. So this message remains profoundly relevant today. And I think our discussions today have highlighted the importance of international dialogue and scientific cooperation and so on. And we bring that as well in a recent statement by the IUPsyS. The statement is called the IUPsyS Statement on War and the Responsibilities of Psychological Sciences, that remind us that war is not only a geopolitical event, but also profound human crisis, generating fear and hatred and so on and so forth. And at the same time, psychology contributes knowledge that can help society move in a different direction to reconciliation and cooperation and forgiveness and so. So this is why psychological science diplomacy matters. And it is very important because it provides us with a mandate to place psychological science in the service of humanity. We, of course, have had that mandate for forever, but we need to be reminded of that, and a mandate to strengthen dialogue and cooperation and to promote peace and human dignity. These, of course, conversations do not end here. And we would like to encourage our colleagues and institutions and students and organizations around the world to promote and to disseminate that statement, but also to participate in our Psychological Science Diplomacy Day for Peace on May 29 of this year, just a couple of weeks from now. There was a question by, I think, a student on what can we do. And I believe that starting by celebrating our participation and our possibilities to promote peace, of course, is one way to do it. And to introduce some of these ideas in our day-to-day activities, in classrooms, in our professional organizations, and so on, is quite important as well. So let me conclude where I began these conclusions, with that enduring vision of the Psychologist Manifesto, and that vision that reminds us that psychology has responsibilities, very important responsibilities, and also ethical and human responsibilities. and we should make that a mandate for the union today. So I hope that our dialogue today will strengthen our commitment to advancing psychological science and science in general, and it does so in the service of humanity, a humanity in peace. So thank you very much to all of you, and I hope I will see you very soon.
And thank you to you, and thanks to everybody that have participated and shared questions and ideas. And I will remind you that this is recorded, so it's possible to see it all again. And we will come back to you with more suggestions for future webinars. So thank you to all of you, and thank you for the panelists. And it has been an honor to be here with you today. Have a nice evening, and let's hope for peace and reconciliation. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Nora.